They pulled me from my mother's womb with forceps that left marks on my skull. I know this because the midwife told my father later, when she thought I couldn't hear, that she almost dropped me when she saw the vertical slit already forming where my forehead should have been smooth. The third eye, already there, already opening, already staring into something that should not be seen. Most Navigator children don't show the gene so early. Most have a few years of normalcy before the mutation makes itself known. I had none of that mercy. The eye was there from the first breath, a closed seam of flesh that pulsed with something that wasn't quite blood. The genitor who examined me 3 hours after my birth made the sign of the Aquila and muttered prayers to the Omnissiah. He wrote in his data slate with shaking hands. Later, I would read those notes. Subject exhibits premature gene activation. Third eye formation complete at birth. Additional mutations probable. Recommend immediate isolation protocols. My mother held me once. Just once. I remember this not because I was conscious, but because she told me about it years later, during one of her rare visits to my sealed wing of the fortress. She held me for exactly 47 seconds. She counted. She said my skin felt wrong even then, too smooth, too cold, like touching something that wasn't quite alive. When the eye moved beneath its closed lid, tracking something invisible in the air above my crib, she handed me to the medici servitor and never touched me again. She tried to explain it to me when I was 8 years old, standing on the other side of reinforced glass, her face carefully composed into an expression that might have been regret. "You have to understand," she said, her voice crackling through the Vox speaker. "You were my first child to show the gene so early. I wasn't prepared. The way you looked at me, even as an infant, it was like you could see through me. See something inside me that I didn't want seen. I didn't respond. What could I say? That I understood? I didn't. I was 8 years old, and I had never been held by my mother except for those 47 seconds I couldn't remember. That I forgave her? I didn't. Forgiveness requires a level of emotional connection I had never been allowed to develop. This is House Argentus, my family, my prison, my entire world for the first 12 years of my life. The fortress estate squats on the edge of Terra's Navigator's quarter like a malformed tumor. Ancient, powerful, built during the unification wars from plasteel and rockcrete that could withstand orbital bombardment. The outer walls are 60 meters thick. The inner sanctums where children like me are kept are buried 300 meters underground, behind blast doors that require 6 different authentication codes to open. Not to keep enemies out, to keep us in. The Navigator's quarter itself is a city within a city. 20 square kilometers of Terra's surface dedicated to housing the mutant nobility who make the Imperium's expansion possible. High walls separate it from the rest of Terra's world city, not to protect us from them, to protect them from us. The normal humans don't like being reminded that the Imperium's survival depends on freaks and abominations. I learned to walk in corridors that never saw natural light. The isolation wing where they kept me was lit by lumens that flickered in patterns designed to prevent circadian rhythm development. They wanted me disconnected from natural time, easier to control, easier to train. The floors were cold metal grating that hurt my bare feet. The walls were bare rockcrete painted institutional gray. There were no decorations, no artwork, no colors except gray and the sickly yellow of the lumens. I learned to speak in rooms where my only companions were servitors whose vocal processors had been removed so they couldn't respond to my questions. The servitors were all failed navigators, I learned later. Members of House Argentus whose mutations had gone too far, who had lost their sanity to warp exposure, who had become liabilities. The janitors had lobotomized them and repurposed them as servants. They cleaned my room. They brought my food. They watched me with dead eyes while I ate alone at a table built for one. I learned to read from data slates that showed me the history of my house, the great navigators who came before me. Aurelius Argentus, who navigated the Emperor's own flagship during the Great Crusade. Septima Argentus, who discovered 17 stable warp routes through the Ghoul stars. Marcus Argentus, who died navigating a critical supply run to Cadia during the Third Black Crusade. His body found in the Navigator's spire with his brain melted from warp exposure, but his hands still locked on the controls. Heroes, they called them. Examples to aspire to. I saw them for what they were. Cautionary tales. Warnings of what awaited me. The tutors came and went. They wore reflective visors that hid their eyes. Not to protect them from me, not yet my third eye was still sealed, but to protect themselves from the constant reminder of what I was. A freak, a mutant, a necessary monster created by genetic manipulation 10,000 years ago during the dark age of technology when humanity thought it could play God. There were 3 primary tutors. Magos Druven, a tech priest who taught me mathematics and astrogation theory. His voice was a mechanical rasp through his Vox grill, and he smelled of machine oil and incense. He never stayed in the room longer than necessary. He would upload lessons to my data slate and leave, returning only to administer tests. I never saw his face behind the augmetics. Lector Hannix taught me High Gothic and Imperial history. He was an old man, possibly 200 years old if the Juvenat treatments were any indication. He had been teaching Navigator children for House Argentus for 70 years. He had seen hundreds of us, watched us grow up isolated and strange, watched us transform into monsters. It had made him bitter. "You exist to serve," he told me once. "Never forget that. You are not people. You are instruments. The Imperium has use for you, and when that use ends, you will be discarded. This is mercy. This is the Emperor's will." I was 6 years old when he said that. The third tutor was different. Her name was Instructor Yara, and she taught me about the warp. She was a navigator herself, from a branch family of House Argentus, too old and too mutated to navigate anymore, but still useful as a teacher. Her skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that had grown in wrong directions. She had no nose, just 2 slits above her mouth. Her hands were webbed, the fingers fused together into flippers. She moved with the help of servo arm augmetics that clicked and whirred with each step. But her eyes, her normal eyes before they had gone fully black, held something I had never seen in any of the other tutors. Compassion. "It will hurt," she told me during my first lesson about warp theory. I was 7 years old. Everything about being a navigator hurts. The opening of your third eye, the voyages through the warp, the mutations, the isolation, all of it. And I cannot tell you it gets better because it doesn't. It gets worse. Every year, every voyage, every moment you spend staring into that terrible sea, it takes something from you. Pieces of your humanity, pieces of your sanity, pieces of your soul. She looked at me with those black eyes, and I saw in them something that terrified me more than any talk of demons or chaos. I saw my future. "But," she continued, "you can survive it. Not unchanged, not whole, but you can survive. And survival, little one, is its own form of victory. The warp wants to break you. The Imperium wants to use you. Your own family sees you as an asset. Your victory is refusing to break completely, bending instead, adapting, becoming something that can endure." "How?" I asked. She smiled. It was a terrible smile on that ruined face. "By accepting that you were never meant to be happy. Once you stop hoping for joy, stop dreaming of normal life, stop wanting things you can never have, then you become free. Free to simply exist, to do your duty without the burden of resentment." I didn't understand then. I was 7 years old and I still had hope. Still believed that maybe, somehow, things would be different for me. That hope died slowly over the next 5 years. I had siblings, 4 of them, 3 brothers and 1 sister. Normal children, beautiful children. Children who inherited the Navigator gene, but whose mutations hadn't expressed themselves yet. They lived in the upper levels of the fortress, in rooms with windows that looked out over Terra's polluted skyline. They had tutors who looked at them without fear. They had toys. They had each other. I watched them through reinforced glass windows. They played in the upper courtyards where real sunlight reached, filtered through haze and smog, but still real, still warm. They laughed, they ran, they touched each other without fear. They were children in a way I would never be allowed to be. My oldest brother was Titus, strong, confident. He was being groomed to become the next Novator of House Argentis, the leader of our family. His Navigator gene hadn't activated yet, and the genitors said it might never. Sometimes the gene skips manifestation, leaves a person almost normal. Just enough mutation to pass the bloodline along without the curse of actually being a Navigator. Titus would rule. I would serve. That was how it worked. My second brother was Lucius, quieter, more studious. The tutors loved him because he absorbed knowledge like a sponge and never questioned their lessons. He would probably become a house administrator, managing contracts, organizing trade routes, important work that didn't require staring into the warp. My third brother was Cato, wild, rebellious. He got in trouble constantly, fighting with tutors, breaking curfew, sneaking into parts of the fortress he wasn't supposed to access. I envied him his rebellion. I had no ability to rebel. My entire wing was sealed. The only way out was through doors I couldn't open. And then there was my sister, Callista. She was 2 years older than me, beautiful in a way that made my chest hurt. Long dark hair that she wore in braids. Eyes the color of Terra's oceans before they were poisoned. A smile that could light up entire rooms. She was kind. That was what made her different from our brothers. Titus was ambitious. Lucius was calculating. Cato was angry, but Callista was kind. Sometimes she would come to the glass window that separated my wing from the rest of the fortress. She would press her hand against it and smile at me. The tutors would pull her away quickly, scolding her for encouraging the specimen. That's what they called me when they thought I wasn't listening. The specimen. As if I was something to be studied rather than someone to be loved. But Callista kept coming back. Once a week, sometimes more. She would stand at the glass and talk to me through the Vox system. She told me about her lessons, about the books she was reading, about the festivals that happened in the upper levels during holy days. She described sunlight to me, how it felt warm on skin, how it made everything look golden. I had never felt sunlight. On my 5th birthday, which no one celebrated except Callista, she brought me a gift. She held it up to the glass, a small wooden carving of an aquila, the Imperial eagle. She had made it herself in crafting lessons. "Happy birthday," she said through the Vox. "I wanted you to have something that's yours, something to remind you that you're not alone." A servitor confiscated it 10 minutes later. Unauthorized items were not permitted in the isolation wing, but for those 10 minutes I held that wooden eagle in my hands and felt something I hadn't felt before. Love. On my 5th birthday, which no one celebrated except Callista, I also watched through that glass window as her eyes began to change. The iris spreading, the white disappearing, the first signs of the Navigator gene activating. She would join me soon, I thought. She would understand what it was like. We would be together. 2 weeks later, they moved her to a different wing. Not mine. A wing for female navigators, where they could monitor her development separately where they could begin her training in isolation from any family members who might provide emotional support. She never came to the glass window again. I asked about her constantly. The tutors ignored my questions. Instructor Yara, the only one who ever showed me any kindness, finally told me the truth when I was 8 years old. "Your sister's mutation progressed rapidly," she said, her webbed hands folded in her lap, "more rapidly than the genitors expected." Her third eye opened fully during a routine examination when she was 6. She saw the warp unprepared, unshielded, with no training. It broke something inside her mind. Is she alive? Yes, but she is not the girl you remember. The warp changes us. Some it changes slowly over decades. Others it changes in an instant. Your sister was changed in an instant. Can I see her? No. House Argentus has decided she is too unstable for family contact. She has been assigned to a specialized training program. If she survives it, she will navigate. If she doesn't. Instructor Yara trailed off. We both knew what happened to navigators who couldn't function. The servitors in my wing were evidence enough. I didn't cry. Crying was discouraged in the isolation wing. Emotional responses were seen as weakness, as instability that might affect our eventual ability to navigate. But inside, something broke. That small piece of me that had hoped for connection, for family, for love, it shattered. I never saw Callista again. 20 years later, I would learn she had died during her 3rd solo navigation voyage, a warp storm near the Maelstrom. Her ship emerged in real space, but the navigator's spire was empty except for her body, which had aged 200 years in the space of a 3-day voyage. The warp had taken her slowly, over what for her had been centuries of subjective time. The crew reported hearing screaming from the sealed spire for most of the journey, but I didn't know that yet. At 8 years old, I just knew my sister was gone. My only connection to family, to normalcy, to kindness, had been severed. The isolation taught me things that normal children never learn. I learned that loneliness is not an emotion but a physical sensation, like hunger or cold. It sits in your chest, heavy and cold, pressing against your ribs until breathing feels like work. It makes your limbs feel heavy. It makes your thoughts slow and circular. It makes the world feel distant, like you're watching everything through thick glass. I learned that a mind left alone too long begins to create companions from nothing. Shadow. Echo. The way air moves through ventilation shafts. I named the servitors even though they couldn't respond. Sigma. Theta. Omicron. Greek letters from ancient Terra, back when humanity still believed in things like individuality and choice. I talked to them constantly, told them about my lessons, asked them questions I knew they couldn't answer, pretended their silence was thoughtful consideration rather than the empty void of lobotomized brains. I learned that you can map every crack in a ceiling when you have nothing else to do, that you can count the rivets in metal floor grating and remember each number, that you can create entire worlds in your imagination when the real world is too small and too gray to bear. I learned that hope is dangerous. Every time I hoped for something, a visit from family, a kind word from a tutor, a change in routine, that hope was crushed. Eventually, I stopped hoping. Instructor Yara had been right. Once you stop wanting things, once you accept that your life is what it is and will never be anything else, a kind of peace descends. Not happiness, never happiness, but peace. The peace of acceptance. I learned about the warp from books and holovids before I ever saw it directly. The Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the place between places where physics breaks down and madness becomes geometry. The tutors showed me diagrams, explained the theory. described how the Emperor's Astronomicon, his great psychic lighthouse on Terra, pierces through the chaos to give navigators something to aim for, something to hold on to while guiding ships through that screaming infinity. They made it sound clean. Scientific. A problem of navigation, not of sanity. They showed me equations that described warp currents, mathematical models of immaterial tides, charts of safe routes and dangerous zones. They made the warp seem manageable, understandable, controllable. They were wrong about everything. At age 9, they began preliminary warp sensitivity training. This involved sitting in a meditation chamber while tech priests played recordings of psychic resonance patterns. The recordings were made by other navigators, their brain patterns during warp exposure translated into audio that supposedly helped young navigators prepare for the real thing. It sounded like screaming mixed with static, mixed with something that might have been words and languages that didn't exist. I sat in that chamber for 4 hours a day, every day, listening to madness distilled into sound. The theory was that it would condition my mind, make me more resistant to the warp's effects. All it did was give me nightmares. I started dreaming about things I had never seen, vast oceans that boiled with colors that had no names, cities that existed in 7 dimensions at once, creatures with too many eyes and no eyes, and eyes that were also mouths that were also hands. I would wake up screaming, and the servitors would stand over me with their dead faces, doing nothing because they had no programming for comfort. The nightmares got worse. By age 10, I couldn't distinguish between sleep and waking. The things I saw in dreams started appearing in the corners of my vision during the day, shadows that moved wrong, faces in the walls that whispered my name. The air itself seemed to thicken, become harder to breathe, as if reality was pressing down on me. Magos Druven examined me with his instruments, Auspex scans, psycho detection equipment, genetic analysis. He determined that my third eye was trying to open prematurely. The warp sensitivity training had triggered something. My navigator gene was activating faster than expected. "We need to accelerate his training," he told my father during a meeting I wasn't supposed to overhear, but did, because the Vox system in my room picked up their conversation from the hallway outside. "The eye wants to open. If we don't control the process, it could happen spontaneously. Unshielded warp exposure at his age would be catastrophic." "How catastrophic?" My father's voice. "Cold, calculating, evaluating an asset. He would either die immediately, or he would survive but be permanently damaged. Catatonic, or worse, functional but warp-touched, a liability to the house. Unacceptable. Begin the awakening ritual. I don't care if he's only 10. Better to risk a controlled opening than an uncontrolled one." So they moved my awakening up by 2 years. The first time they opened my third eye fully, I was 10 years old, not 12 like most navigators. The ritual took place in a chamber deep below even my isolation wing, a place that had existed since the founding of House Argentus 10,000 years ago. The walls were covered in wards and sigils that hurt to look at. The floor was inscribed with circles of protection that glowed with faint psychic energy. The air tasted of metal and fear. They strapped me to a chair that adjusted itself to my body's angles. My head was locked in place with a brace that dug into my temples, hard enough to leave permanent scars. My hands were cuffed to armrests. My feet were locked to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't escape, could barely breathe. 6 janitors attended. 2 psychic dampeners stood by in case something went wrong. My father watched from behind armored glass. He didn't look at me directly. He never did. To look at me would be to acknowledge me as a person rather than an investment. The master navigator of House Argentus, an ancient man named Severus, whose skin had gone completely transparent, revealing the black bones underneath, stood before me. He was 300 years old if the records were accurate. He had been navigating since before my grandfather was born. His own third eye was enormous, taking up half his forehead, a terrible black void that seemed to drink in light. When he moved, his robes rustled with a sound like dry leaves. When he breathed, it rattled like something dying. "You will experience discomfort," he said. His voice sounded like wind through a crypt, like someone speaking from inside a tomb. "This is normal. Do not resist. Resistance causes madness. The warp must be accepted, not fought. Let it flow through you. Let it show you what you are meant to see." He placed his withered hands on either side of my head. His touch was ice, colder than ice. His fingers felt like they were made of frozen metal, and where they touched my skin, I felt something pulling, not physically. Deeper than that, he was pulling at something inside me, at the genetic code that made me a navigator, at the mutation that defined my existence. "Open your eye, child," he whispered. "See what you were made to see." I felt it before I saw it, a pulling, a tearing, as if someone had hooked fingers into my brain and yanked upward. The vertical seam on my forehead split, not like an eyelid opening, but like flesh being ripped apart from the inside. I felt the skin separate, felt something beneath it moving, adjusting, focusing. There was no pain. Not at first. That came later. First, there was just sensation, then vision, light. But not light as humans understand it. This was light that moved in dimensions that shouldn't exist. Light that had color beyond the spectrum. Light that sang and screamed and whispered promises that would drive a normal person into immediate catatonia. Light that was also sound, that was also touch, that was also emotion, that was also something else entirely. Something that humans had no words for and no ability to process. The warp. I saw it fully for the first time, and it saw me. Imagine standing on the shore of an ocean that extends in every direction forever, including up and down in directions that don't exist in normal space. Now imagine that ocean is made of thought and emotion and dream and nightmare all mixed together, churning and boiling and never still, never calm, never safe. Imagine that this ocean has been gathering the psychic waste of humanity for 10,000 years. Every scream, every fear, every hatred, every madness, all of it flowing into one infinite sea. Now imagine that this ocean notices you, looks back, recognizes you as something small and soft and breakable. That was the first second. The second second was infinitely worse. Things moved in that ocean. Shapes that couldn't be shapes because they existed in too many dimensions at once. Entities that had no beginning or end, no inside or outside, no distinction between where they ended and the warp began. Some were small, barely conscious, fragments of emotion given temporary form. Hungry ghosts, lost souls, the psychic echoes of people who had died badly. Others were vast, ancient, terrible. They moved through the warp like whales through ocean, if whales were made of screaming and had mouths that extended into dimensions where mouths shouldn't exist. They were demons, though I didn't know that word yet. Servants of the chaos gods. Creatures born from the worst impulses of sentient life, given form and purpose and hunger. They pressed against reality like faces pressed against glass, distorting, stretching, always watching, always waiting for any weakness in the barrier between dimensions. They wanted to break through, to spill into real space, to tear and consume and corrupt everything they touched. And one of them noticed me. It was small, as demons go. Maybe just a lesser demon of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery. But to my 10-year-old mind, it was incomprehensibly vast. It had feathers made of fire and fire made of lies. It had eyes that blinked in sequences that contained mathematical proofs of why hope was futile. It had wings that extended into tomorrow and yesterday simultaneously. It spoke my name, not my given name, not Navigator or Specimen or any title House Argentus had assigned me. It spoke my true name, the name that was written in my soul before the Navigator gene twisted everything. The name I didn't know I had until it was spoken by something that should not have known it. The sound of that name being spoken in the warp by a demon permanently damaged something inside my mind. I can't remember the name now. My brain refuses to hold the memory, but I know it happened. I know that something in the warp recognized me as an individual, called to me, tried to establish connection, and I couldn't close the eye, couldn't look away, couldn't escape. Once open, it stays open until the process is complete. Duration, approximately 47 minutes. The tutors had told me this. They didn't tell me how long 47 minutes could feel when you're staring into hell while hell stares back. Master Severus's voice came from very far away, distorted, barely audible over the roaring of the warp. Find the light, child. The Emperor's light. Focus on it. Let it guide you back to yourself. The Astronomicon. I could see it, a golden thread in that sea of madness, a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, except the fog was made of screaming and the lighthouse was the psychic might of the God Emperor of mankind, channeled through 10,000 sacrificed psychers daily to create a beacon that pierced the warp itself. It was distant, flickering, weak compared to the roaring chaos around it, but real, human, something to hold on to, something that said, this direction is home, this direction is safety, this direction is reality. I reached for it mentally, extended my consciousness toward it like a drowning person reaching for a rope. The things in the warp pulled back. They didn't like the Emperor's light. It burned them, repelled them, reminded them of their defeat during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor had pushed them back into the dark corners of the galaxy. But they didn't leave. They circled, waiting, patient. They had eternity. They could afford to wait, and they would be there every time I opened my third eye. Every voyage I ever made, every second I spent navigating, they would be watching, waiting, looking for any moment of weakness. The 47 minutes passed. Subjectively, it felt like years, like I had lived an entire lifetime in that chair, staring into the warp, feeling my sanity crack and reform over and over until I wasn't sure what sanity even meant anymore. When they finally closed my third eye, when Master Severus placed his frozen hands over my forehead and forced the lid to seal, I discovered I had been crying blood. My own blood, mixed with something else, something that glowed faintly in the dim light of the chamber. Red-black tears that had run down my face and soaked into the collar of my robe. I had also bitten through my lower lip completely, the flesh hanging in shreds, and fouled myself, waist and waist running down my legs, and torn skin from my wrists struggling against the restraints, digging into the metal cuffs until bone showed through. "Acceptable," Severus said, examining readouts on a data slate held by one of the genitors. The subject maintained coherence. No signs of immediate warp taint. Mutation within expected parameters. Psychological damage appears standard. He will be functional. Parameters. Functional. As if my mind-breaking was just data to be recorded. As if the fact that I would never be the same person I was 47 minutes ago was just an expected outcome. They carried me back to my quarters. I couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't process what I had seen. For 3 days I lay in bed, staring at nothing, feeling the echo of that terrible ocean rolling through my skull. Sometimes I still felt the third eye trying to open, even though it was sealed. Sometimes I still heard that demon speaking my true name, the syllables echoing in a place beyond hearing. On the 4th day, I got up and looked in the mirror that hung in my quarters. My skin had changed. Paler than before, almost translucent now, like wax paper. I could see veins beneath the surface, dark blue rivers running through white flesh. I could see organs moving inside my torso if I looked carefully. My eyes, the normal ones, had started to lose their color. The brown iris was fading to gray, washing out like old fabric left in sunlight. My hair was falling out. Not all of it, not yet. But clumps came loose when I ran my hands through it, leaving patches of bare scalp. The skin of my scalp had begun to change too, hardening, developing a texture like scales, though they were soft still, barely noticeable unless you touched them directly. My fingers looked longer. The bones had begun to change. Not much, maybe half a centimeter, but enough that when I spread my hand on the mirror's surface and compared it to the outline I'd traced there last week, I could see the difference. I was 10 years old, and I was already becoming something else. Something that would never be fully human again. That night, alone in my sealed quarters with only the servitors for company, I cried. Not from pain, though there was pain. Not from fear, though I was afraid. I cried from understanding, from the terrible knowledge that had settled into my bones during those 47 minutes of staring into the warp. This was my life now. This would always be my life. Every day, every year, every decade I survived, I would become less human and more something else. The mutations would worsen. The exposure to the warp would accumulate. My sanity would erode, my body would twist, and eventually I would either die or become something that could no longer pass for human, even by Navigator standards. There was no escape except death, and even death might not be enough. The things in the warp knew my true name. They had seen me. They would remember me. Forever. When I died, would my soul pass into the warp like all human souls? And if it did, what would those things do to me there? I cried until I had no tears left, until my body was empty of everything except exhaustion. Then I slept and dreamed of oceans that boiled with colors that had no names. Welcome to House Argentus. Welcome to the Navis Nobilite. Welcome to your duty. Welcome to your damnation. Word count 6,514, continuing to reach 10,000 plus. The training intensified after my awakening. Now that my third eye could open, House Argentus wanted to maximize my usefulness as quickly as possible. Every day followed the same pattern. Wake at 0500 hours. Meditative exercises for 2 hours, focusing on maintaining mental shields against warp influence. Breakfast delivered by servitors, a nutritional slurry designed by genitors to support Navigator physiology. More meditation. Then the real work began. They brought me to training chambers deep in the fortress where other young navigators were being prepared. I had never seen other Navigator children before, had never interacted with anyone close to my age except glimpses of my siblings through glass. Now I was suddenly surrounded by a dozen other children, all between ages 10 and 15, all showing various stages of Navigator mutation. There was Garrett from House Argentus's branch family, 12 years old, whose hands had already begun webbing. He couldn't use standard controls anymore, needed specialized equipment adapted to his changed physiology. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice was slurred because his tongue had started changing shape. There was Serena from a vassal house bound to House Argentus through ancient contracts. 14 years old, her skin had turned pale blue like ice, and her third eye was always slightly open, a vertical slit that leaked a faint glow. She had gone partially blind in her normal eyes, but could see better in the warp than most navigators twice her age. This made her valuable. This also made her unstable. I watched her have 3 seizures during that first week of group training, her body convulsing while the other children backed away, and the instructors simply waited for it to pass, before continuing the lesson. There was Marcus, 10 like me, whose mutations were minimal. Just the third eye and slight discoloration of his hair, which had gone silver white. He was lucky. He would pass for almost human for years, maybe decades. But the other children hated him for it, resented his relative normalcy. They bullied him constantly. I stayed out of it. I'd learned early that attachment, even alliance, led only to pain. There was Delara, 15, who wouldn't live to see 16. Her mutations were catastrophic. Both arms had atrophied into useless appendages. Her spine was curved in 3 places that spines shouldn't curve. Her face had begun shifting, bones rearranging themselves into configurations that made normal speech nearly impossible. But her third eye was powerful, unusually strong. So House Argentis kept her alive, fed her, trained her, squeezed every bit of use from her before the inevitable collapse. She died 4 months into my training. Heart failure. Her body simply couldn't sustain the strain anymore. The instructors removed her body during lunch break. By the afternoon session, another Navigator child had taken her place. The cycle continued. We practiced warp sight together, opening our third eyes in controlled environments, looking at small tears in reality maintained by captured demons bound in stasis fields. The demons would scream and promise things. Power, knowledge, freedom from pain. We were taught to ignore them, to see them as navigational hazards, nothing more. Objects to avoid rather than entities to fear. But I feared them. Every time my third eye opened, even in these controlled exercises, I remembered that first demon who had spoken my true name. Wondered if it was out there still, in the warp, waiting, watching. The other children formed bonds, friendships born from shared suffering. They would talk during rare free periods, sharing stories of their families, their fears, their hopes for eventual voyages. I remained separate. Instructor Yara had taught me that attachment was weakness, that emotional connection would make the horror harder to bear. You cannot save each other, she told me once, when she noticed me watching the other children play some child's game during a rest period. You can barely save yourselves. Every attachment you form is another weight to carry, another pain to feel when they inevitably die or go mad or transform into something you no longer recognize. Stay apart, stay focused, survive. So I stayed apart, but I watched. I learned their names even if I never spoke to them. I memorized their mutations. I noticed when they disappeared and new children took their places. I kept count. In 3 years of group training from age 10 to 13, I saw 37 Navigator children come through those chambers. By the time I left for my first assignment, only 8 remained functional. The others had died, gone mad, or mutated beyond usefulness. This was the winnowing. This was what the Imperium didn't speak about. For every navigator who successfully guided ships through the warp, 3 died during training. For every veteran navigator with decades of service, 10 had burned out after just a few voyages. The Navi's nobilité maintained its power through sheer attrition, producing enough navigator children to replace the constant losses. We were expendable, all of us. The houses just pretended otherwise to maintain the illusion of nobility. At age 13, they finally permitted me limited access to the upper levels of the fortress. Not freedom, never freedom, but expanded confinement. I could move between my quarters and the training chambers and the library without escort. Could eat in the common dining hall where other navigators gathered. Could see more of the fortress than just gray walls and metal floors. The library became my refuge. Thousands of books and data slates collected over 10 millennia. Histories of House Argentis, technical manuals on ship systems, records of famous voyages, Imperial propaganda about the glory of service, and hidden in the back sections, forbidden texts that the genitors didn't know younger navigators could access. I read everything, absorbed knowledge like a sponge because knowledge was control, and control was survival. I learned about the other navigator houses, their strengths and weaknesses, their political positions, their famous members and their catastrophic failures. I learned about the Paternova, the mysterious leader of all navigators, who lived in the palace of the navigators on Terra and somehow amplified our abilities through psychic connection. I learned about the selection process when a Paternova died, how all the heirs apparent would fight to the death, transforming into monsters in their desperation to ascend. I learned about renegade houses, navigator families that had been exiled from the Navi's nobility for various crimes, genetic tampering that went too far, chaos, corruption, political betrayals. These renegades lived on the edges of the Imperium, navigating for pirates and rogue traders and anyone desperate enough to hire them. They often transformed into hideous abominations, their mutations running rampant without the stabilizing influence of the Paternova. But they were free in a way, free from house politics, free from obligation. Sometimes I wondered if freedom at the cost of accelerated mutation was worth it. I also learned, in those forbidden texts, the truth about how navigators were created. The dark age of technology. M22. Scientists playing with human DNA. Genetic engineering to create a subspecies that could perceive and navigate the warp without immediate madness. They had succeeded. Barely. At tremendous cost. The navigator gene was stable enough to pass through generations, but unstable enough that it caused constant mutations, constant suffering. We were designed to suffer. It was part of the specifications. The genetic engineers had known that warp exposure would damage us, had known the mutations would be severe, had known the psychological trauma would be catastrophic. They had calculated all of this and decided it was acceptable. Necessary. Humanity needed warp travel to conquer the galaxy. Navigators made warp travel possible. Therefore, navigators would be created regardless of their suffering. No one had asked our permission. No navigator in history had ever chosen this life. We were born into it, shaped by it, destroyed by it, and then replaced by our own children who would suffer the same fate. This knowledge should have made me angry, should have filled me with rage at the injustice of it all, but I felt nothing, just cold acceptance. The anger had been burned out of me during that first awakening, during those 47 minutes of staring into the warp. What was the point of rage against something that happened 10,000 years ago, against a system so vast and so entrenched that no individual could hope to change it? I accepted, I adapted, I survived. At age 16, they decided I was ready for preliminary voyages. My first assignment was a short run. Terra to Mars, the red planet visible from Terra on clear days, though there were no clear days anymore. 5 light minutes of distance in real space, a journey that would take days or weeks with standard drives. With warp travel, mere hours. But those hours would be spent in hell. The ship was an Apocalypse-class battleship called Emperor's Wrath. 300 meters long. Crew of 4,000, weapons capable of cracking continents, armor thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment. And at its heart, buried in the ship's spine like a tumor, the Navigator's spire. My prison for the duration. I was brought aboard via private shuttle, transferred directly to the spire, without ever seeing the rest of the ship. The spire was sealed. Temperature controlled. Pressurized separately from the rest of the vessel. 1 chair, 1 viewport, 1 Vox system for communication with the bridge. 1 door that locked from the outside, standard quarters for a navigator. A cage with a view. The chair was designed for navigator physiology. It adjusted to the mutations that made sitting in normal furniture difficult. Cushioned sections for webbed hands, reclined positioning for curved spines, restraints for when the warp exposure caused convulsions. I strapped myself in and ran through the pre-flight meditation protocols. Focus, center, clear the mind of all unnecessary thought. The instructors made it sound like achieving enlightenment. It felt more like preparing for surgery without anesthesia. Captain Veritax, a stern woman with 40 years of void service, spoke through the vox. "Navigator, all systems ready. Begin translation on your mark." I took a breath, held it, released slowly, then opened my third eye. The warp rushed in, the ship lurched, reality tearing like fabric, and suddenly we were elsewhere. Not in real space, not in the warp, not exactly. In transition, suspended between dimensions, held in place by the Geller field that surrounded the ship like a bubble of reality in an ocean of madness. I could see the warp through the viewport. Not literally see, because eyes don't work like that in the Imperium, but perceive, experience, witness. The colors had no names. The shapes had no geometry. The entities that swam through the chaos noticed us immediately, attracted to the bubble of reality like sharks to blood. They couldn't reach us. The Geller field held, but they pressed against it, testing its strength, looking for any weakness. If the field failed, even for a second, they would pour in. The crew would go mad, would turn on each other, would tear their own flesh in ecstasy or terror or both. The ship would become a ghost vessel, drifting through the warp forever, crewed by things that had once been human. I had to ignore the demons, had to focus on navigation. The Astronomicon burned somewhere to my left, a golden thread through the chaos. I locked onto it, used it as a reference point, calculated our heading, our speed, our position relative to our destination. Mars. 5 light minutes away in real space. But in the warp, distance meant nothing. Direction meant nothing. We could arrive in an hour or a year or 10,000 years from now, all depending on the currents, the tides, the whims of entities beyond comprehension. I guided the ship through, adjusted heading when warp currents shifted, maintained course despite demons trying to lure us off path, held my sanity together through sheer stubborn refusal to break. The voyage took 4 hours real time, 4 subjective hours of staring into madness. My nose bled continuously. My third eye dried out, cracked, wept fluid that wasn't quite tears. My hands shook on the chair's armrests. My heart raced, then slowed, then raced again as my body tried to process what my brain was experiencing. When we translated back into real space, when reality snapped back into place and Mars filled the viewport, I vomited, emptied my stomach onto the deck, then convulsed for 5 minutes straight while my nervous system tried to remember how normal physics worked. The medici servitors entered once I had stopped shaking. They cleaned me, examined vitals, administered drugs to stabilize my metabolism, noted new mutations that had appeared during the voyage. Scales along my forearms. Tiny, translucent, like fish scales, but hardening already into plates. Standard warp exposure mutations, the medici servitor reported in its flat, dead voice. Subject remains functional. Functional, that word again. As long as I could still navigate, nothing else mattered. I was 16 years old and I had completed my first voyage. I would complete thousands more. Each one would leave new marks, new mutations, new scars on my sanity. This was my life now. This would always be my life. And it would kill me eventually. But not today. Today, I had survived. And for a navigator, survival was victory enough.